When David bought his house in the spring of 2023, he thought he'd finally found the perfect place. It was a cozy ranch-style home with a big backyard built way back in the 70s. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with tree-lined streets and friendly faces. But the best part? The house wasn't part of any homeowners association. No rules about what color he could paint his door. No restrictions on his lawn decorations. And definitely no monthly fees going to some random board of neighbors who thought they owned the street. David had learned his lesson from his last place. He'd spent 3 years dealing with an HOA that sent violation notices if your trash cans were visible for more than 2 hours after pickup. They'd actually fined his neighbor $800 for hanging the wrong shade of Christmas lights. So this time David did his homework. He read through every single page of the property deed. He asked his real estate agent 3 times to confirm. He even paid a lawyer $200 just to double-check that his new home was completely, totally, 100% HOA-free. The lawyer had smiled and pointed to a line in the deed that basically said the property was built before any HOA existed in the neighborhood and was forever exempt from joining. David had felt like he'd won the lottery. Finally, a place where he could just live his life without someone breathing down his neck about whether his mailbox was the approved shade of black. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. David painted his front door a nice shade of blue. He planted tomatoes and peppers in his backyard because he'd always wanted a vegetable garden. He even put up a little fence around the garden to keep the rabbits out. His neighbors seemed nice enough. They waved when he checked his mail. An older couple across the street brought him cookies as a welcome gift. Life was good. Then came the letter. David found it taped to his front door on a Tuesday afternoon. It was printed on fancy cream-colored paper with an embossed header that read, Maple Grove Homeowners Association, in gold lettering. He almost laughed. Clearly someone had made a mistake and put it on the wrong door. But then he started reading. Dear homeowner, it began. It has come to our attention that your property is in violation of several community standards. Your vegetable garden is not in compliance with Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, which states that all gardens must be ornamental in nature and located in designated areas. Additionally, you have failed to pay your annual HOA dues of $500. Please remit payment within 10 days to avoid additional late fees. It was signed by someone named Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. David stared at the letter for a full minute. Then he checked the address at the top. Nope, it definitely said his house number. He walked back inside and pulled out his property deed from the filing cabinet. Right there, clear as day, was the exemption clause. This Patricia person had obviously gotten her wires crossed. He figured the easiest thing to do was just ignore it. Mistakes happen. She'd realize her error eventually. David crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the recycling bin. 3 days later, another letter appeared. Same fancy paper, same gold lettering. This one was less polite. Second notice, it screamed at the top. Your continued failure to comply with HOA regulations is unacceptable. The vegetable garden must be removed within 5 days. Your outstanding balance is now $600, including a $100 late fee. Failure to pay will result in a lien being placed on your property. Now David was getting annoyed. He sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a polite email to the address listed at the bottom of the letter. He explained that there had been a mistake, that his property was not part of the HOA, and attached a scanned copy of his deed showing the exemption. He hit send and figured that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 days later, David came home from work to find a woman standing in his driveway. She was probably in her mid-50s, wearing white capri pants and a striped shirt that looked like it cost more than David's car payment. Her hair was styled in that specific way that required weekly salon visits. She was holding a clipboard and staring at his vegetable garden like it had personally insulted her family. Can I help you? David asked, getting out of his car. The woman turned and looked him up and down with an expression that suggested she'd just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. You must be the new owner, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. Oh, David said, trying to keep his voice friendly. I actually sent you an email about that. There's been a mix-up. My house isn't part of the HOA. Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes. I received your email, and your property records are incorrect. David blinked. I'm sorry, what? Your deed is wrong. Patricia said, like she was explaining something simple to a child. Every property on Maple Street is part of this HOA. It's been that way since 1985. But my house was built in 1974, David said. A full 11 years before the HOA existed. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. That's irrelevant. The HOA covers all properties in this subdivision. Someone made a clerical error when they filed your deed. But don't worry, we can fix that. You'll just need to sign some paperwork and pay your back dues. Since you've been living here for almost a month, that's now $500 for this year, plus a late fee, plus the violation fine for the garden. Let's call it $800 to keep things simple. David felt his jaw dropping. I'm not paying $800 for an HOA I'm not part of. Patricia's expression hardened. Young man, I've been the president of this HOA for 12 years. I know every single property in this neighborhood. You are part of this association whether you like it or not. My lawyer says otherwise, David said, trying to stay calm. Then your lawyer is wrong. Patricia pulled a paper from her clipboard and held it out. This is a formal violation notice. You have 7 days to remove the vegetable garden and pay your dues, or will be forced to take legal action. David didn't take the paper. I'm not removing anything, and I'm not paying you a cent. Patricia's face went red. 2 other people had walked up during the conversation. A man and a woman who both wore matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on them. They stood behind Patricia like bodyguards. This is Brian and Nancy, our board members, Patricia said. We've all reviewed your property. You're in violation of multiple bylaws. I showed you my deed, David said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. My house is exempt. Patricia stepped closer, invading his personal space. Her perfume was overwhelming. Your deed is wrong, she said slowly, like she was talking to someone who didn't speak English. And I don't appreciate your attitude. This neighborhood has standards. We don't tolerate people who think the rules don't apply to them. She thrust the violation notice at his chest. David took it reflexively. 7 days, Patricia said. Then she turned on her heel and marched back down his driveway, her board members following behind her like ducklings. David stood there holding the paper, watching them climb into a white Lexus parked across the street. As they drove away, he noticed several of his neighbors peeking through their curtains. They quickly looked away when he made eye contact. He went inside and read the violation notice. It was 3 pages long and listed everything from his garden to the color of his mailbox to the height of his grass. At the bottom was a total, $1,200 in fines. David pulled out his phone and called his real estate lawyer. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The lawyer David had used for the house purchase listened to the whole story, and then sighed deeply. Look, I can write them a letter explaining that you're exempt, but honestly, these HOA types usually don't care. They'll just keep harassing you until you either give in or lawyer up for real. My advice, ignore them. They can't actually do anything to you. David wanted to believe that. He really did. But Patricia didn't seem like the type to just give up and go away. He was right. The next week, David got a certified letter. He had to sign for it at the post office, which meant taking time off work. Inside was a bill for $1,500. Patricia had added more late fees and something called an administrative processing charge. The letter said if he didn't pay within 14 days, they'd place a lien on his house. David called his lawyer again. Can they actually do that? Put a lien on my house? Technically no, the lawyer said. But they might try anyway. It would be illegal and you could fight it, but fighting it costs money. Look, I'll send them a cease and desist letter. That usually scares these people off. The cease and desist letter did not scare Patricia off. Instead, things got worse. Much worse. David started noticing his trash cans knocked over every Tuesday morning after pickup. At first he thought it was animals. Then he checked his doorbell camera footage and saw a car driving by slowly at 2 in the morning, someone reaching out and pushing his cans over. The license plate was too blurry to read. Then came the code enforcement visits. David was washing dishes one Saturday morning when someone knocked on his door. It was a tired-looking guy in a city uniform holding a clipboard. Got a complaint about your property, the inspector said. Someone says your mailbox is installed at the wrong height. David stared at him. My mailbox? Yeah, HOA complaint. I gotta check it out. The inspector pulled out a measuring tape and checked David's mailbox. 42 inches. That's actually perfect. Meets code exactly. He made a note on his clipboard. "You're good. Sorry to bother you. Who called this in?" David asked. The inspector shrugged. "Anonymous complaint through the HOA. We get a lot of these. Most of them are nonsense, but we have to check every one." 3 days later, another inspector showed up. This time someone had complained that David's grass was too long. The inspector measured it with an actual ruler. "Your grass is 2¼ inches. Code says it has to be under 4 inches. You're fine." "Let me guess," David said. "Show a complaint?" "Yep, same person keeps calling. We're starting to recognize the voice." The complaints kept coming. Someone said his house numbers weren't regulation size. Another complaint claimed he had junk cars in his driveway, even though all David had was his regular Honda Civic. Someone reported that he was running an illegal business from his home because he had a laptop. Every single complaint was investigated and found to be completely false. "Look, buddy," one inspector told him after the 8th visit in 2 weeks, "between you and me, this is harassment. Someone's got it out for you. You might want to file a police report." David did file a police report. The officer who took his statement was sympathetic but not helpful. "This is really a civil matter. If they're not threatening you or damaging your property, there's not much we can do. You could try getting a restraining order, but that's tough to get for something like this." Then Patricia kicked things up another level. David came home from work one day to find a neighborhood meeting invitation in his mailbox. Not his personal mailbox at his door, but his actual USPS mailbox at the curb, which meant someone had opened it and put the invitation inside. That was a federal crime, but David had bigger problems. The invitation announced an emergency HOA meeting to discuss serious violations and property value concerns on Maple Street. He knew exactly what property they were talking about. David decided to go to the meeting. He wanted to see what Patricia was telling everyone. The meeting was at the community center, and when David walked in, about 30 of his neighbors were already seated. Patricia stood at a podium at the front, looking like she was about to give the State of the Union address. She saw David enter, and her mouth tightened, but she kept smiling. "Welcome, everyone. Let's get started." For the next 20 minutes, Patricia painted a picture of David as some kind of neighborhood criminal. She claimed he was destroying property values with his unsightly garden. She said he was a freeloader who refused to pay his fair share. She implied that he was planning to turn his yard into some kind of farm with chickens and goats, which was complete fiction. Several neighbors looked over at David with suspicious expressions. Finally, David raised his hand. "Can I say something?" Patricia's smile got tighter. "Of course. We value all input." David stood up. His hands were shaking a little, but he kept his voice steady. "Everything she just said is a lie. I'm not part of this HOA. My property deed explicitly exempts my house because it was built before the HOA existed. I've shown her the deed. I've had a lawyer confirm it. I'm not refusing to pay anything because I don't owe anything." "Your deed is incorrect," Patricia said immediately. "We've been over this. My deed is filed with the county. It's a legal document. You can't just say it's wrong because you don't like it." One of the neighbors, an older man David had waved to a few times, spoke up. "Patricia, if his deed says he's exempt, then he's exempt. That's how property law works." Patricia's face flushed. "The deed has an error. It happens all the time. The county makes mistakes." "Then show us proof," the man said. "Show us the original HOA documents that say his property is included." Patricia shuffled some papers. "I don't have them with me right now, but I assure you." "So you're asking us to believe you without any evidence?" Another neighbor asked. David saw his opening. "I brought copies of my deed for anyone who wants to see them." He pulled out the folder he'd prepared and started passing copies around. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but people were now reading David's deed and murmuring to each other. A woman in the third row stood up. "Patricia, I think we need to table this until we can verify the facts. If his property really isn't part of the HOA, we're wasting everyone's time and potentially opening ourselves up to a harassment lawsuit," someone else added. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. "This meeting is about maintaining our community standards. We can't just let anyone do whatever they want." "He's not part of our community," the older man interrupted. "According to his deed, anyway. Unless you have evidence otherwise, I think we're done here." People started standing up and gathering their things. Patricia was still talking, but nobody was listening anymore. As David left, a few neighbors actually apologized to him. "We didn't know the full story," one woman said. "Patricia made it sound like you were being difficult on purpose." David drove home feeling like maybe things would finally calm down. Patricia had been embarrassed in front of the whole neighborhood. Surely she'd back off now. He should have known better. 2 days later, someone spray-painted "Pay your dues" across his driveway in huge red letters. David called the police, filed another report, and spent his Saturday scrubbing paint off concrete. His doorbell camera had mysteriously stopped working the night before. The SD card was missing. Then his Wi-Fi started having problems. The cable company came out and found that someone had cut his service line, where it connected to the main line at the street. "That's weird," the technician said. "That doesn't usually happen by accident." David was starting to feel like he was being watched all the time. He'd see cars driving by his house slowly. He'd catch people taking pictures of his property from the street. One evening, he looked out his window and saw Patricia standing on the sidewalk with a tape measure, measuring his fence. He knocked on the window. Patricia looked up, made a note on her clipboard, and walked away without any reaction at all. That night, David barely slept. He kept hearing noises outside. Every car that drove by made him tense up. This was supposed to be his dream home, and instead it had turned into a nightmare. The final straw came on a Wednesday morning. David went to his car to drive to work and found all 4 tires slashed. Someone had also keyed a message into his driver's side door, "HOA rules." This time when David called the police, he was shaking with anger. The officer who responded looked at the damage and whistled. "This is escalating. Whoever's doing this is getting bolder." "I know who's doing it," David said. "The HOA president. She's been harassing me for 2 months. Can you prove it?" "Not directly." "But who else would write HOA rules on my car?" The officer shook his head. "Without evidence, there's nothing we can charge. But you need to protect yourself. Get more cameras. Keep records of everything. And honestly, you might want a lawyer up for real. This isn't going to stop on its own." David called his insurance company and filed a claim. Then he sat in his garage looking at his damaged car and made a decision. Patricia wanted a fight? Fine. She was going to get one. But David wasn't going to fight fair. He was going to fight smart. He picked up his phone and started searching for lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. Someone who wouldn't just write a letter and hope for the best. Someone who would actually take this to court if necessary. By the end of the day, David had consultations scheduled with 3 different attorneys. One of them had a reputation for absolutely. The lawyer's office didn't look like David expected. He'd imagined dark wood paneling and leather chairs. But Jennifer Torres ran her practice out of a modern building with glass walls and bright artwork. She was younger than David thought she'd be, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Tell me everything," Jennifer said, pulling out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." David spent the next hour explaining the whole mess. The letters, the harassment, the vandalism, Patricia's obsession with making him join an HOA he wasn't part of. Jennifer took notes and asked questions, sometimes making him backtrack to clarify details. When he finished, Jennifer sat back and tapped her pen against her notepad. "Okay, so here's the situation. You're clearly not part of this HOA. Your deed is crystal clear about that. But Patricia either doesn't understand property law or doesn't care. My guess, she doesn't care. She's used to bullying people into compliance. Can we sue her?" David asked. "We can. Harassment. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Possibly defamation depending on what she's said about you. But here's what I want to do first. I want to look at the HOA itself. Because in my experience, when someone acts this crazy, there's usually something else going on." "What do you mean?" Jennifer leaned forward. "Patricia is going way too hard on this. Most HOA presidents would have backed off after you showed them your deed. The fact that she's escalating tells me she's either completely delusional or she's got something to hide. Maybe both. I want to request copies of all the HOA documents. Their incorporation papers, bylaws, financial records, meeting minutes, everything. Can you just request that? If we file a lawsuit, yes. It's called discovery. They have to hand it all over. And trust me, digging through HOA records is like digging through someone's garbage. You learn all kinds of interesting things." David felt a small spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "So what do we do?" "First, I'm going to send them a very serious cease and desist letter. Not like the one your real estate lawyer sent. This one is going to explain exactly what laws they're breaking And what will happen if they don't stop? Then we're going to file a lawsuit. Not just for harassment, but I'm also going to request that the court examine whether this HOA is even legally valid. What do you mean? Jennifer smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd found a weakness and was about to exploit it. A lot of HOAs, especially older ones, have problems with their legal structure. They didn't file the right paperwork. They didn't follow their own bylaws. They've been operating in ways that violate state law. If we can prove any of that, we can argue the HOA has no legal authority over anyone, including their actual members, and you can do that? I've done it 3 times. Dissolved entire HOAs because they were operating illegally. It's rare. But when you've got someone like Patricia who's clearly out of control, it usually means nobody's been paying attention to whether they're following the rules. And that's when things get interesting. David left that meeting feeling better than he had in weeks. Jennifer was expensive, no question about that. But she seemed to know exactly what she was doing. And more importantly, she didn't seem scared of Patricia at all. The cease and desist letter went out 2 days later. Jennifer had shown David a copy before she sent it. It was 6 pages of legal language that basically boiled down to, "Stop harassing my client or we will destroy you in court." It listed every single incident, every false code enforcement complaint, the vandalism, everything. It demanded they stop all contact immediately and warned them that any further harassment would result in immediate legal action. For 3 blissful days, nothing happened. No letters, no complaints, no cars driving by slowly. David started to think maybe the cease and desist had actually worked. Then he got served with a lawsuit. Patricia and the Maple Grove HOA were suing him for $15,000 in unpaid dues, late fees, and violation fines. The lawsuit claimed he had willfully and maliciously refused to comply with HOA regulations. It said his property was causing irreparable harm to neighborhood property values. It demanded payment plus their legal fees. David called Jennifer immediately. "Perfect," she said. "Perfect? They're suing me for $15,000, and they just made a huge mistake. By filing this lawsuit, they've opened themselves up to full discovery. I can now request every single document they have. Every email Patricia has sent. Every financial record, everything. They've given me the keys to the kingdom." Jennifer filed a response to the lawsuit that basically said David owed nothing because he wasn't part of the HOA, and then filed a massive countersuit. She sued Patricia personally and the HOA as an organization for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, and about 6 other things David didn't fully understand. But the big one, the one that made David sit up and pay attention, was the request for the court to dissolve the HOA entirely. "You weren't kidding about that," David said when he read the filing. "Never kid about dissolving an HOA," Jennifer replied. "Now we wait for discovery." That's when the fun begins. The HOA's lawyer was a guy named Robert Chen, who worked at a small firm that specialized in HOA law. Jennifer had gone up against him before. "He's competent but not creative," she told David. "He'll do everything by the book, which works in our favor because I'm guessing his clients haven't been doing things by the book." Discovery requests went out. Jennifer asked for everything: incorporation documents, tax filings, bylaws, amendments to bylaws, meeting minutes for the last 10 years, financial statements, bank records, the list went on and on. It was hundreds of pages of requests. The HOA's response was a mess. First, they tried to claim most of the documents were confidential. Jennifer shot that down immediately. Then they said some documents had been lost over the years. Jennifer told the court that was unacceptable. Then they started turning over documents in dribs and drabs, always at the last possible minute before a deadline. Jennifer spent weeks going through everything. David would get calls from her at odd hours. "Did you know they haven't held an actual election in 7 years? Or, look at this, their bylaws say they need 5 board members, but they only have 3. But the real bombshell came when Jennifer got the financial records. She called David on a Tuesday evening. He could hear the excitement in her voice. "Sit down. You're not going to believe this. What did you find? Patricia has been stealing from the HOA thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. The records are such a mess it's hard to tell exactly how much. But there are transfers from the HOA account to her personal account labeled as expenses that make no sense. $3,000 for landscaping consultation when Patricia isn't a landscaper. $5,000 for legal research when there was no ongoing legal case. It goes on and on. David felt his mouth drop open. She's embezzling? That's exactly what she's doing. And it gets better. Remember how she kept insisting you owed dues? I don't think the HOA actually has proper legal authority to collect dues at all. They never properly incorporated as a nonprofit. They're just a random group of neighbors collecting money with no legal structure, which means every dollar they've collected might have been collected illegally. How is that even possible? You'd be amazed how many HOAs operate in this gray area. They've got enough paperwork to look official. But when you actually dig into it, they never crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. And because most people don't fight back, they just keep operating like they have real authority. Jennifer started putting together a case that was about way more than just David's harassment. She contacted former board members. She tracked down neighbors who had paid fines and dues over the years. She found 3 other people Patricia had sued before, all of whom had settled because fighting seemed too expensive and exhausting. One of those people was an older woman named Helen, who'd sold her house and moved away just to escape Patricia. She sued me for painting my front door red, Helen told Jennifer on a phone call that Jennifer recorded with permission. Red, she said it wasn't an approved color. I fought it for 6 months and finally just paid her $3,000 to make it go away. Then I sold my house at a loss just to get out of that neighborhood. That woman is a nightmare. Jennifer tracked down the HOA's original incorporation documents from 1985. Or rather, she tried to. They didn't exist. The HOA had never properly incorporated. They'd filed some paperwork with the county registrar, but had never completed the actual process of becoming a legal entity. For almost 40 years, they'd been operating as basically a neighborhood club with no legal standing. This is bigger than your case, Jennifer told David. This is about shutting down an illegal operation that's been scamming people for decades. As the court date got closer, Jennifer's case file grew thicker and thicker. She had documentation of Patricia's embezzlement. She had proof the HOA was never legally incorporated. She had testimony from people Patricia had harassed. She had records of false code enforcement complaints. She had everything. Patricia's lawyer tried to settle. Multiple times. First, he offered to drop the lawsuit if David would just drop his. Jennifer said no. Then he offered to pay David $5,000 to go away. Jennifer Cohn. The courtroom was more packed than David expected. He recognized several of his neighbors sitting in the gallery. Some looked curious. Others looked angry, though David wasn't sure if they were angry at him or Patricia. A few people he didn't recognize were there too, and Jennifer whispered that they were probably former HOA members who'd heard about the case and wanted to see what happened. Judge Morrison walked in and everyone stood. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and glasses that made her look like someone's grandmother. But the way she surveyed the courtroom made it clear she was nobody's sweet old granny. She had a reputation for being fair but absolutely no nonsense. Please be seated, Judge Morrison said. Let's begin. This is the case of Maple Grove Homeowners Association versus David Thompson. I've reviewed the initial filings. Ms. Torres, you're representing Mr. Thompson. Jennifer stood. Yes, Your Honor. And we've also filed a countersuit. I saw that. Quite a lengthy countersuit. We'll get to that. Mr. Chen, you're representing the HOA? Robert Chen stood up. He looked nervous already. Yes, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Chen, this is your suit. Let's start with you. Tell me why we're here. Chen cleared his throat and launched into his opening statement. He claimed David had moved into the neighborhood and immediately started violating HOA rules. He said David refused to pay dues despite multiple notices. He painted David as someone who thought he was above the rules and was hurting property values for everyone else. It was all lies, but Chen delivered it with enough confidence that David started to worry. What if the judge believed this nonsense? Then it was Jennifer's turn. Your Honor, my client has been the victim of a targeted harassment campaign that has lasted for months. But before we even get to that, there's a fundamental question this court needs to answer. Does this HOA have any legal authority at all? Because my research suggests it doesn't. Judge Morrison raised her eyebrows. That's a bold claim, Counselor. I'm prepared to back it up, Your Honor. But first, let's address the HOA's claim that Mr. Thompson owes them money. I'd like to submit Exhibit A, which is Mr. Thompson's property. Deed. Jennifer walked up and handed copies to the judge and to Chen. David watched. The judge read through it carefully. This deed explicitly states the property is exempt from any homeowners association, Judge Morrison said. It says so right here in Section 14. Exactly, Your Honor. My client's property predates the HOA by 11 years. It was never part of the association and never will be. He owes them nothing. Chen stood up quickly. Your Honor, we believe that deed contains an error. The county sometimes makes mistakes when filing property records. Do you have any evidence of this error? Judge Morrison asked. Chen shuffled through his papers. We have the original HOA covenant documents from 1985 that state all properties on Maple Street are included in the association. May I see those documents? Chen walked forward and handed over a folder. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reading. David could see her frown deepening. Mr. Chen, this document lists the properties included in the HOA. Mr. Thompson's address is not on this list. That must be an oversight, Your Honor. Every property on Maple Street, is his address on this list or not? Chen deflated a little. Not specifically, but then by your own documents, Mr. Thompson's property is not part of this HOA. Case dismissed. Judge Morrison reached for her gavel. Wait, Jennifer said. Your Honor, if I may, while we appreciate the dismissal of the HOA's frivolous suit, we'd like to proceed with our countersuit. There are serious issues here that go beyond just my client's harassment. Judge Morrison put down her gavel. I'm listening. Your Honor, in the course of discovery, we uncovered evidence that this HOA has been operating illegally for nearly 40 years. They were never properly incorporated. They have no legal standing to collect dues from anyone. And furthermore, the HOA president has been embezzling funds for years. The courtroom erupted. People gasped. David heard someone in the gallery say, I knew it. Patricia's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Order. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. Ms. Torres, those are serious accusations. I have documentation, Your Honor. Financial records, bank statements, everything. The HOA has been collecting dues and fines from neighborhood residents. But they're not a legally incorporated nonprofit. They're just a group of neighbors collecting money with no legal authority to do so, and Ms. Whitmore has been transferring significant amounts of that money to her personal accounts. Chen jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Ms. Torres is making wild accusations without any basis. I have 47 pages of financial records that say otherwise, Jennifer interrupted. I'd be happy to submit them as evidence. Judge Morrison looked at Chen. Did you review these financial records during discovery? Chen looked uncomfortable. We provided the records Ms. Torres requested, but did you review them yourself? No, Your Honor. I trusted my clients to provide accurate information. That was your first mistake, Judge Morrison said dryly. Ms. Torres, submit your evidence. Let's see what you have. For the next 2 hours, Jennifer systematically destroyed Patricia and the HOA. She showed bank transfers that made no sense. She presented testimony from Helen, the woman who'd been sued over her red door. She brought up the 3 other people Patricia had sued, all of whom had settled because they couldn't afford to fight. She showed that the HOA had never filed the proper incorporation paperwork. They'd started the process in 1985 but never completed it. For decades, they'd been operating as if they were a legal entity, when they were really just a neighborhood group with no actual authority. But people still paid them, Jennifer said, because Ms. Whitmore and her board members acted like they had authority. They sent official-looking letters. They threatened liens and lawsuits. They bullied people into compliance. And when someone like my client actually stood up to them and checked the law, they escalated to harassment and vandalism. Chen tried to object multiple times, but he had no good answers. Patricia sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and smaller. At one point, she tried to whisper something to Chen, but he held up his hand to stop her. Jennifer saved the best for last. She pulled out Patricia's personal bank statements, which they'd gotten through a subpoena. Your Honor, in the last 3 years alone, Patricia Whitmore has transferred over $50,000 from the HOA account to her personal account. These transfers are labeled as expenses, but the expenses don't make sense. $3,000 for landscaping consultation, when Ms. Whitmore has no landscaping credentials. $5,000 for legal research when there was no active legal case. $2,000 for community outreach materials with no receipts or documentation of what those materials were. Judge Morrison was reading the bank statements with a look of disgust. Ms. Whitmore, do you have an explanation for these transfers? Patricia stood up. Her voice was shaking. Those were legitimate expenses, Your Honor. Running an HOA costs money. I have to manage everything, deal with complaints, coordinate with vendors. Did the HOA board approve these expenses? Judge Morrison asked. I am the president. I have discretion over. That's not what I asked. Did the board vote to approve these specific expenses? Patricia's mouth opened and closed. We discussed the budget generally. So that's a no. Judge Morrison looked at Chen. Mr. Chen, did your client inform you about these transfers during discovery? Chen looked miserable. No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm learning of the specific amounts. Your Honor, Jennifer said, these transfers represent just what we could find in 3 years of bank records. Ms. Whitmore has been president for 12 years. The total amount of embezzlement could be much higher. I didn't embezzle anything, Patricia shouted. She was standing now, her composure completely gone. I worked hard for this neighborhood. I spent hours and hours dealing with problems, coordinating maintenance, keeping property values up. By harassing my client? Jennifer asked calmly. By filing false code enforcement complaints? By vandalizing his property? I never vandalized anything. Someone spray-painted "Pay Your Dues" on his driveway. Someone slashed his tires and keyed HOA rules into his car door. Are you saying that was just a coincidence? Patricia's lawyer grabbed her arm and pulled her back down to her seat. He whispered urgently in her ear. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair. She looked tired. I've seen a lot in my years on the bench, but this is something special. Ms. Torres, what exactly are you asking this court to do? We're asking for several things, Your Honor. First, a judgment in favor of my client on all counts. Second, damages for the harassment and emotional distress he's suffered. Third, reimbursement of all his legal fees. And fourth, we're asking the court to officially dissolve the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. The gallery erupted again. Judge Morrison banged her gavel for order. Dissolve the HOA? Chen said. Your Honor, that's extreme. There are 30 families in this neighborhood who are members of an illegally operating organization, Jennifer cut in. An organization that has been collecting dues without legal authority and using those dues for personal enrichment. Your Honor, this HOA has no legal standing. It was never properly incorporated. By definition, it doesn't legally exist. We're just asking. The courtroom exploded. Some people cheered, others looked shocked. A few people actually started clapping until Judge Morrison banged her gavel so hard David thought she might break it. Order, I'm not finished. She waited until everyone quieted down. The dissolution of this HOA means several things. First, any dues or fines collected by this association in the past year will need to be returned to residents. Ms. Whitmore, you'll be working with a court-appointed auditor to determine exactly how much money needs to be returned and to whom. Patricia looked like she might pass out. Second, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to the financial irregularities. Ms. Whitmore, you should probably contact a criminal defense attorney. Patricia's lawyer was writing furiously on his legal pad. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but in that courtroom. Third, I'm awarding Mr. Thompson damages in the amount of $25,000 for harassment and emotional distress, plus all of his legal fees. Ms. Whitmore, you will be personally responsible for paying these damages since the HOA no longer exists as a legal entity. David's mouth dropped open. $25,000, plus legal fees? He'd expected maybe a few thousand if they won. This was way more than he'd hoped for. And finally, Judge Morrison said, looking directly at Patricia, I want to be very clear about something. What you did to Mr. Thompson was not only illegal, it was cruel. You used your position to bully and harass someone who was doing nothing wrong. You filed false complaints. You encouraged vandalism. You made his life miserable because he dared to stand up to you. That kind of behavior has no place in any community, and I hope you learn something from this experience. Patricia was openly crying now. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to come undone. Her expensive clothes suddenly looked ridiculous. She wasn't a powerful HOA president anymore. She was just a woman who'd been caught stealing and lying and bullying people. This court is adjourned. Judge Morrison banged her gavel one final time and left. The courtroom erupted again, but this time Judge Morrison didn't stop it. People were standing, talking loudly, arguing. Several of David's neighbors came over to shake his hand. An older woman he recognized from 3 houses down actually hugged him. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much. I've been paying that woman money for 10 years and I always wondered if it was legal. She said I'd lose my house if I didn't pay. I was scared." Others had similar stories. A younger couple said Patricia had fined them $5,000 when they painted their house without approval. They'd paid it because they were new to the neighborhood and didn't know any better. An older man said Patricia had threatened to put a lien on his house because his mailbox was dented. He'd replaced it even though it cost $300 and the old one was fine. The stories kept coming. For 45 minutes, David stood in that courtroom listening to his neighbors describe years of intimidation and fear, all because of one woman who'd decided she could make up rules and force everyone to follow them. Patricia left quickly, her lawyer practically dragging her out a side door. She didn't look at anyone. David caught a glimpse of her face as she walked past. She looked destroyed. Part of him felt bad for her. But then he remembered the spray, paint on his driveway and the slashed tires and the months of constant anxiety, and the sympathy disappeared. Jennifer was packing up her briefcase, smiling. "I told you it would be fun." "That was better than fun," David said. "That was incredible." "How did you know she'd been embezzling?" Experience. People who act that crazy about small rule violations are usually hiding something big. The embezzlement is almost always there if you look hard enough. Patricia got so used to being in charge that she thought she could do whatever she wanted. She forgot that laws apply to everyone. They walked out of the courthouse together. The afternoon sun was bright and warm. David felt lighter than he had in months. It was like someone had been sitting on his chest and finally got up. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now Patricia's life gets complicated. The DA will investigate the embezzlement. If they press charges, and I think they will, she could be looking at jail time. At minimum, she'll have to pay restitution to everyone she stole from. And she owes you $25,000 plus my fees, which were not cheap." "Will she actually pay?" Jennifer shrugged. "She'll have to sell some things, maybe her house. The court will make sure you get your money one way or another. It might take time, but you'll get it." Over the next few weeks, David watched the fallout unfold. Patricia's house went up for sale. The listing said, "Motivated seller," which was real estate code for desperate. David heard through the neighborhood grapevine that her husband had left her. Her adult kids weren't speaking to her. She'd gone from being the most powerful person in the neighborhood to being completely isolated. The district attorney did press charges. David had to testify at a preliminary hearing where Patricia's new lawyer tried to argue she'd just made accounting mistakes. The DA showed that over 12 years, Patricia had stolen more than $200,000 from the HOA. It wasn't mistakes, it was systematic theft. Patricia eventually pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud. She got 3 years in prison and 10 years probation. She had to sell her house, her car, and most of her possessions to pay restitution. David got his $25,000 plus legal fees. The other neighbors who'd been overcharged or scammed got some of their money back too, though not all of it. $200,000 spread across 30 families didn't go very far. But the money wasn't really the point. The point was that Patricia couldn't hurt anyone anymore. The neighborhood changed after the HOA dissolved. At first, people didn't know what to do. They'd been living under Patricia's rules for so long, they thought they still needed permission to do things. Gradually, people realized they could paint their doors whatever color they wanted. They could plant vegetable gardens. They could let their grass get a little long without someone measuring it with a ruler. Some people loved it. They felt free for the first time in years. Others were nervous. A few tried to start a new HOA, but it never got off the ground. People had learned their lesson about giving too much power to neighborhood busybodies. David became a minor neighborhood celebrity. People would stop him while he was checking his mail to say thanks or to tell him their own Patricia stories. It was a little embarrassing, but also kind of nice. He'd moved to this neighborhood to find peace and quiet, and he'd ended up having to fight for it. But he'd won. His vegetable garden grew beautifully that summer. He had more tomatoes and peppers than he knew what to do with, so he started leaving baskets of them on neighbors' porches. It became a thing. Other people started planting gardens too. By the end of summer, half the street had vegetable patches in their yards. One Saturday in August, someone organized a block party. It wasn't official or structured, just a cookout where everyone brought food and hung out in the street. David brought tomatoes and peppers from his garden. Someone else made burgers. Someone brought a speaker and played music. The older woman who'd hugged him in the courtroom came over with a plate of cookies. "This is the first time I've felt like this neighborhood is actually a community," she said. "When Patricia was in charge, everyone was afraid to talk to each other. We were all too worried about getting reported for some violation. Now we can just be neighbors." David thought about that a lot in the following months. An HOA was supposed to bring a community together, but Patricia's version had done the opposite. It had turned neighbors into enemies. It had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. And for what? So one woman could feel powerful and steal money? The house next to David's went up for sale in September. A young couple bought it, first-time homeowners excited about their new place. David went over to introduce himself on the day they moved in. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said. "I'm David, right next door." "Thanks. I'm Alex, and this is my wife Taylor. We're so excited to be here." "It's a good neighborhood," David said. "Real friendly and no HOA, so you can do whatever you want with your house." Alex laughed. "That's actually one of the reasons we bought here. We looked at other places, but they all had HOAs with crazy rules. Taylor wanted to paint the front door yellow, and I didn't want to have to ask permission." "Paint it whatever color you want," David said. "Plant a garden. Put up Christmas lights in July. Nobody's going to bother you about it." That night, David sat in his backyard looking at his vegetable garden. The tomato plants were dying off. Now as the weather cooled, but they'd produced an amazing crop. He thought about everything that had happened since he'd moved in. The harassment, the stress, the vandalism, the lawsuit. It had been awful at the time. But looking back, he was almost glad it had happened. Not because he'd enjoyed it. He wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But because he'd learned something important. He'd learned that standing up to bullies was worth it. He'd learned that people who act like they have authority don't always actually have it. And he'd learned that sometimes the system actually works if you're willing to fight for what's right. Patricia had tried to make his life miserable because he wouldn't follow her rules. Instead, she'd lost everything. Her posit,